My husband's junior partner scheduled his consultation with the family law attorney, assuming I was too absorbed in paint swatches and fabric samples to notice. She'd smile whenever I called the office, that practiced, polished smile of someone who knows exactly which secrets she's keeping. He had been planning it for months, a clean exit that would leave me with just enough to feel grateful. What he never accounted for was the fact that while he was busy building his escape, I was quietly dismantling everything he thought he owned. The first sign arrived on a Wednesday morning in February, the kind of gray, bone-cold morning that makes you understand why people leave Ontario. I was in the kitchen making coffee when my husband's phone buzzed against the granite counter. He was still upstairs, and the preview lit up before the screen dimmed. Can't stop thinking about last night. I stood there with the coffee scoop suspended in my hand, reading those 5 words until they blurred. In 16 years of marriage, I had never once looked through his phone. I had been, as he often said with something that sounded like affection, a woman who trusted completely. I set down the scoop. I started the coffee, and I said nothing when he came downstairs straightening his tie, kissing my cheek with the familiar ease of a man who had not yet learned that his wife was paying attention. I was 42 years old. I had spent the first decade of our marriage building my own interior design practice, and the second decade slowly letting it dissolve because it was easier for both of us if I was available for the dinner parties, the charity galas, the summers at the cottage in Muskoka, the school runs and grocery runs, and every other domestic current that kept our life flowing smoothly. My husband was a senior partner at one of Bay Street's most respected corporate law firms. His career required a particular kind of wife, and I had become her so gradually that I hadn't noticed the woman I used to be quietly packing her things and leaving. I noticed her absence clearly on a Thursday evening 3 weeks after that first text, when I pulled his wool overcoat from the closet to take to the dry cleaner and a receipt fell from the inner pocket. Canoe. One of the best restaurants in the city. A table for 2 on a Tuesday. The same Tuesday he'd told me he had a client dinner in Mississauga. 2 tasting menus. A bottle of Burgundy I recognized by price alone, the kind he never ordered when we went out together because, as he always said, there was no point spending that kind of money on wine when I could barely tell the difference between a Pinot and a Merlot. I stood in the front hallway holding that small paper rectangle and felt something cold move through my chest. Not quite grief. Something harder. Something that took a long time to name. I slid it back into the pocket. I hung up the coat. I did not go to the dry cleaner. The password change came a month later. I'd gone into his home office to retrieve a file. We had always shared access to the household accounts, a practical arrangement that I had managed without complaint for years. But when I typed in his usual password, the one we'd used since we moved into this house, the screen refused me. I tried variations. His mother's name, our anniversary, the name of the first property he ever bought. Nothing. He had locked me out of our shared financial life with the same quiet efficiency with which he apparently did everything else. I sat in his leather chair and looked at my own reflection in the dark monitor and thought, he's been planning this for a while. The calls to his office became their own kind of education. His junior partner always answered with a warmth that was just barely too warm, the way you speak to someone you feel faintly sorry for. He's in with a client right now, Diana. Can I take a message? There was something in the way she said his name, not Mr. Holloway, just his first name, that told me everything I needed to know about the particular intimacy she felt she'd earned. I thanked her each time with perfect courtesy. I hung up. I wrote down the date and time in a small notebook I kept inside my bedside table, underneath a novel I'd been pretending to read. The confirmation came at the firm's spring client reception at the Four Seasons. My husband had suggested, with what I recognized in retrospect as relief, that I skip it. You've been tired lately. It'll just be standing around talking shop. I had agreed and then changed my mind an hour after he left, arriving just as the cocktail hour was thinning into dinner. I spotted him immediately near the window, the city spread out below them in spring dusk. She stood beside him the way you stand beside someone when you've forgotten to maintain professional distance. Her wrist caught the light, a delicate gold cuff bracelet that I had admired in a Bloor Street boutique window the previous autumn, the kind of piece I'd mentioned once, in passing, and he had glanced at the price and said something about not being the kind of people who spent that kind of money on jewelry. I had laughed and agreed and walked away from the window. The bracelet now sat on another woman's wrist, and she was laughing at something my husband had just whispered in her ear. I left before he saw me. I sat in my car in the parking garage for 11 minutes by the clock on the dashboard. Then I drove home, made myself a cup of tea, and called my sister. My sister was an accountant. Not the glamorous Bay Street kind. She ran her own firm, small and meticulous, the kind of practice built on absolute precision and the complete absence of ego. She had never particularly liked my husband, a feeling she had managed with characteristic discipline by simply not forming an opinion about him out loud. When I told her what I'd seen, what I'd been seeing for months, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Tell me what's in the accounts you can still access." That was when I understood that whatever happened next, I would not be doing it alone. It was my sister who suggested I speak to a financial analyst she'd worked with on a client case involving hidden marital assets. His name was Patrick. He was methodical, entirely unimpressed by credentials, and had spent the better part of 15 years helping people find money that other people were trying to make disappear. When I sat across from him in my sister's office with a folder of the financial records I had managed to copy before the passwords changed, he reviewed everything with the unhurried patience of someone who has seen this particular story many times before. "Your husband has been restructuring," he said, not looking up from the statements. "Slowly, for about 2 years. You see these transfers." He pointed to a series of modest amounts moving from a joint investment account into something called Holloway Capital Holdings Incorporated Shell Company. Federally registered but nothing real inside it. "He's been bleeding assets into a structure you have no visibility into." I asked him what that meant for our matrimonial home. He looked up then. "That depends entirely on what he does with it next. Ontario's Family Law Act is clear: the matrimonial home is jointly owned regardless of whose name is on title. He can't sell it without your signature. But there are ways to complicate your claim to its equity." He paused. "Has he said anything about selling?" My husband had, in fact, mentioned once or twice over the previous month that the house might be too much to maintain as we got older. That perhaps something smaller would suit us better. That the market was strong. I had nodded and said nothing because I had learned, by then, to treat every conversation as a source of information rather than an exchange. Patrick nodded slowly when I told him this. "He's setting up the narrative. Making it seem mutual." That evening I sat in our kitchen while my husband ate the dinner I had made and talked about a case he was working on, and I watched him perform the role of man who had nothing to hide. And I thought, "You taught me that marriage can be a kind of theater." I've been taking notes. The documents I began finding after that were not hidden so much as placed somewhere a disinterested wife would never look. A commercial lease agreement for office space registered to Holloway Capital Holdings Incorporated. Investment account statements from a firm I didn't recognize, forwarded to a post office box I found the key to at the back of his desk drawer behind a box of old business cards. A handwritten note in his own careful script, a list of account numbers and a single instruction: transfer balance before Q3. He had not hidden any of this from me specifically. He had simply never imagined I would look. I photographed everything. The note from his junior partner was the piece that changed the shape of what I understood to be happening. It arrived not in the house but in his briefcase, which he'd left open on the kitchen bench one evening, and I saw it folded beneath a legal pad, a single page, handwritten, with a warmth that was entirely unprofessional. She had outlined a timeline. "Once the separation is formalized and the house sells, you'll have full access to move funds from HCH without any entanglement issues." She was not just his affair. She was his legal strategist for the dissolution of our marriage, using her position inside his own firm to help him architect my financial ruin from the inside. My husband thought he was divorcing a woman who had spent 16 years not understanding money. He was about to discover he'd been living with someone who'd spent the last 4 months understanding nothing else. My sister introduced me to a family law lawyer named Claire. I want to be precise about Claire. She was small and soft-spoken and possessed the particular stillness of someone who has heard every version of this story and found, every single time, the specific thread that unravels it. When I showed her the photographs, the statements, the note, she read through everything without changing expression. Then she set the folder down and said, "The shell company is his mistake. He's been running personal assets through a corporate structure to hide them from family property division. But he hasn't been careful enough about the paper trail. This is fraud on the family property. It changes everything." She explained her plan with the clarity of someone who does not waste words. I would hire a second, very visible lawyer, someone with a reputation for settling quickly and for less than clients deserved. My husband would feel the relief of believing the legal battle would be simple. Claire would remain completely invisible. officially acting only as a consultant on the financial side of the file. While my husband's team was busy congratulating themselves on an easy negotiation, Claire and Patrick would be building a case that would surface the moment the proceedings concluded. The house was the key. My husband had quietly engaged a real estate agent. I found the listing agreement in the Holloway Capital Holdings documents, predated, waiting for the moment our separation made selling possible. The property had been assessed by an appraiser I did not recognize, at a figure approximately $340,000 below market value. My husband was planning to sell our home at an artificially deflated price and claim a lower equity split based on that number. The buyer, Claire confirmed after Patrick's investigation, was a numbered company with no visible connection to my husband but with financial trails that led, eventually, back to the same post office box. He was planning to buy our house from himself, at a discount, while I signed away my share based on a fraudulent valuation. I spent one evening with a glass of Niagara Riesling and my sister on my back deck, looking at the garden I had planted over 16 years, and I said, "I want him to buy this house." My sister looked at me for a moment. Then she smiled for the first time in months. "Tell me what you're thinking." What I was thinking was this: if my husband wanted to purchase this property through an anonymous corporate structure, then he should have the opportunity to compete for it on the open market. Like everyone else. Through a small firm my sister knew in Ottawa far enough from Toronto to avoid any professional overlap, I established a numbered company with no visible connection to me. I had saved, quietly, over the preceding months. Not dramatically. Small amounts, moved carefully, on the advice of Patrick, into accounts my husband had no visibility into and no reason to look for. The kind of money a woman accumulates when she stops buying the things her husband assumes she's buying. The kind of savings that are invisible to a man who believes his wife has no financial life of her own. I submitted a competing offer on our own house. My husband did not know who he was bidding against. He only knew, through the listing agent, that another buyer had entered with a strong offer and was prepared to move quickly. I watched him at dinner one evening, speaking on the phone with his lawyer, his voice tightening in a way I recognized as anxiety. He countered. I countered. He came in with his best number. Mine was better by $12,000. The house sold to my numbered company on a Thursday afternoon in September, conditional on financing I had already secured through a mortgage broker in Ottawa. Claire filed our separation agreement the following Monday. My husband learned about the competing buyer the same day he received the statement of claim that identified every account connected to Holloway Capital Holdings, the fraudulent appraisal, the predated listing agreement, and the corporate structure he had spent 2 years building. He learned that his junior partner's handwritten note constituted documented evidence of a plan to commit matrimonial property fraud. He learned that under Ontario's Family Law Act, the equalization of net family property does not reward concealment, it penalizes it. He learned that Claire, the quiet consultant he had never noticed, had been his wife's actual lawyer for 4 months. He called at 7:14 inches the morning. I was in my kitchen. I let it ring. The Law Society referral came 3 weeks later. My husband's junior partner had, in her enthusiasm to be useful, used her position at the firm to access documents and provide legal advice that constituted a conflict of interest on a scale that would require its own separate process to address. I had not reported her. The paper trail had done that on its own. The firm's managing partners, protective of the firm's reputation in ways that had nothing to do with loyalty to anyone, moved quickly and without sentiment. She resigned before they could ask her to leave. Her name, in the close professional community of Bay Street, became a word people used carefully and quietly, the way you handle something that has fallen and broken. My husband's settlement offer arrived through his new lawyer. He had retained someone outside his firm, an obvious necessity given the circumstances on a Tuesday afternoon. It was, Claire told me, a serious offer from a man who had finally understood the position he was in. I read it at the kitchen table while the October light came through the windows I had chosen for this house, and I felt something I had not expected, not satisfaction exactly, but clarity. The kind of clarity that comes when you stop performing grief and start simply living in truth. I accepted a modified version. Not everything. Not the maximalist outcome Claire could likely have achieved if we had gone to trial. What I accepted was what was fair, which was, as it turned out, considerably more than what my husband had planned to leave me with. The matrimonial home came back to me in my name, the fraudulent appraisal having rendered the original sale agreement void. The Holloway Capital Holdings assets were brought into the equalization calculation in their entirety. I kept the Muskoka cottage because I had been the one to find it, negotiate the offer, furnish it, maintain it, and love it for 11 years. He kept his pension, his RRSP, and the cost of his own legal bills, which were, by that point, considerable. He came to the house once, in November. I saw his car from the upstairs window and felt, to my own mild surprise, nothing in particular. I went downstairs and opened the door. He looked smaller than I remembered. Not physically, he was the same man but diminished in some essential way, the way a room looks smaller when you remove the furniture that was filling it. He was holding a bottle of wine. Not the Burgundy, something from the LCBO, the kind of thing you grab when you don't have time to think. He said he wanted to talk. I said he could come in. I made him sit in the living room, the same room where we had hosted 2 decades worth of dinner parties, where our families had gathered for holidays, where I had once believed I was happy in the way you believe things when you haven't yet examined them carefully. He sat on the sofa that I had reupholstered myself 2 summers ago, in a fabric I had chosen without consulting him because by then I had learned that his opinions on soft furnishings were actually opinions about control. He told me he'd made mistakes. He used the word mistakes the way people use umbrellas as a covering device rather than an acknowledgement of weather. He said he'd lost sight of what mattered. He said he thought, if I was willing, that we might find a way to start again. I looked at him for a moment. Then I opened the drawer of the side table beside me and placed a folder on the coffee table between us. I said, I want to show you something. The folder contained a timeline. Photographs of the documents I had found, organized by date. The text message preview from that February morning. The receipt from Canoe. The listing agreement predated to begin selling our home before I had agreed to sell it. The note in his junior partner's handwriting. The account statements from Holloway Capital Holdings, annotated by Patrick, with arrows showing where the money had gone. 16 months of careful, methodical observation, assembled into something that looked exactly like what it was, not the grieving confusion of a betrayed wife, but the patient work of a woman who had been paying very close attention. I said, I've been paying attention since February. He didn't say anything. He looked at the documents the way you look at something you recognize but cannot quite account for, the expression of a man confronting the gap between who he believed he was dealing with and who he had actually been dealing with, all along. I said, you believed I didn't understand money. You believed I couldn't read a corporate filing. You believed that 16 years of making your life comfortable meant I had stopped thinking. I let you believe that. I needed you to believe that. I paused. You taught me that this marriage was a performance. I was a better student than you expected. He tried to say something. I don't remember exactly what it was, some version of explanation, some attempt to locate the shape of a justification. The words were familiar in their architecture. I had heard their construction many times, in many forms, over the previous months of watching him perform the role of husband while preparing the role of ex-husband who would leave me with nothing. I told him he was welcome to finish his wine before he left. He didn't. He stood up, put on his coat, and walked to the door. At the threshold he turned back once, and I could see him assembling something, some parting line, some final note that would let him leave with a degree of dignity. Whatever he found, he thought better of saying it. He left. I locked the door behind him. I stood in the hallway of my house, and breathed in the quiet the way you breathe after a long effort. Claire called that evening to confirm the final transfer of title. Patrick had sent his closing report. My sister called shortly after to say she was opening a bottle of sparkling and did I want to come over. I did. I ran into his junior partner once, months later, in the Loblaws on Bayview. She was in the cereal aisle, looking at her phone. She appeared smaller than I remembered her at that reception, the polished authority she'd performed in phone calls and handwritten notes reduced to something more ordinary in the fluorescent light of a Saturday morning grocery. I dare. She looked up, and for a moment we were both perfectly still, and I waited to feel something, anger, satisfaction, the specific pleasure of a score settled. What I felt instead was something close to indifference. Not the forced indifference of someone trying not to feel a thing. The genuine kind, which comes from having moved far enough forward that the rearview mirror shows nothing you need to revisit. She looked away first. I found the oat bran I came for and went to check out. My husband's final text came sometime in the new year. An apology, formally worded, the way a lawyer writes an apology, precise in its acknowledgement of wrongdoing, careful not to specify exactly which wrongdoing it was acknowledging. He said he hoped I was well. He said he hoped I could find it in myself someday to forgive him. I read it twice. I put my phone down. I thought about the garden I was replanting in spring, the client I had just taken on to redesign a Victorian semi in Cabbagetown, the pottery class I had started in October that was producing, so far, objects my sister diplomatically described as abstract. I thought about the particular freedom of being a person whose time belongs entirely to herself. I deleted the message. Not in anger. In the simple, quiet way you clear space for whatever comes next. The woman who had packed his lunches and deferred to his opinions and trusted completely and smiled at parties while her husband whispered into another woman's ear she was gone. I didn't mourn her exactly. She had done the best she could with what she understood at the time. But the woman who replaced her understood considerably more, and she was, on balance, better company. The highway north opens up past Barrie. When the city finally releases you and the trees close in on both sides and the sky gets bigger than you remember it ever being in Toronto. I drove up to the cottage alone that first spring, after everything had settled into its final shape, and I sat on the dock as the ice finished going out and the lake came back to life around me. I had a coffee in my hands and no particular plans for the rest of the day. The afternoon light came off the water at the angle that has always made me feel, with great certainty, that whatever else is true, this exists and I am in it, and that is not a small thing. It was the first time in years I had been somewhere beautiful and not wondered whether I was allowed to simply stay. If this story of quiet precision resonated with you, tap that like button now. My favorite moment was the auction, the look on a man's face when he realizes the anonymous buyer who outbid him was sitting across from him at dinner every night. What was yours? Drop it in the comments. And subscribe so you don't miss what comes next.